Hello everybody, I am going to be showing a game today which was played last night in the Chess League, which I am a part of. Again, I'm on board 1. I'm playing somebody who's got years of experience in various London chess leagues. I was white. I decided this time to start off with my c4 as a move, see what my opponent will respond with. And they played g6, so this indicates usually a King's Indian or Benoni setup. Knight c3, bishop g7, g3. I'm also setting up my English with the fianchetto, as is my custom. Knight f6 and knight f3. Now, I used to play the move pawn e4, which is the English Botvinnik. However, black actually has a very, very good move, pawn to c5, in this setup, and their bishop is no longer blocked by the e5 pawn. If black had done a pure King's Indian, this generally is considered to be about equal. I think white is supposed to keep a very small edge, but very, very easy to play for black. I don't really think white gets much from this at all. But if black had already played e5, then I may have played e4 going into the Botvinnik. I played knight f3 though, castles, and I castled as well, seeing how they play. And e5 was chosen, which is perfectly reasonable as a move. So I go straight into the mainline King's Indian positions with d4. Now black's move, and it would be a mistake for black to push their pawn to e4, because if they were to do this move, pawn to e4, I would have knight g5, which would attack the pawn 3 times. It's only defended once, so it will be captured relatively quickly by my pieces. Instead, knight bd7 was chosen, which is perfectly valid as a move, and I could do d takes e, which may give me a slight edge. Pawn e3 is a move I don't like because it blocks in my c1 bishop, and bishop g5, while being a candidate move, may run into h6 in the near future, which I'm not terribly pleased with. So I played this waiting move, h3, but it also by delaying the move and seeing how black sets up in order for me to play the best systems, it also allows me to do a move bishop e3 in the future, which will prevent the knight going to g4 attacking my bishop. And also black won't be able to do bishop e6, queen d7 as effectively, because I always have king h2, which will be preventing their bishop going to h3 and trading off the light squared bishops. Black goes rook e8. Now the move e4 is valid, so I prevent it with my own e4 push. And black certainly can take on d4, and I will take back with the knight, leading us into a kind of almost Maroczy bind, except for the fact the c-pawn is still on the board. I generally find that white is perfectly fine here. Slight advantage, nothing major. But it's a pleasant position for white's pieces, and the space advantage is giving white the edge. c6 is a book move, I think. I've faced it a few times, and I respond. Bishop e3, this is still pretty much in theory at the moment. And my opponent does a6, and I never really know how to respond to this move. I've seen it played a few times, because black is attempting to play b5, a bit like in a perk, and get a queenside initiative. So I have played a4 a few times, that attempts to stop b5, but it weakens all my dark squares like b4, a5, c5. So I don't really like playing a4. It's a pawn move that doesn't really achieve much. And I couldn't see the best place for my queen. I assumed it might be c2, which would defend the e4 pawn enough that I never have to worry about it. But it would also take away defenders from d4. And queen d3 and queen d2 to me don't look as good. But it's possible that queen d2 is the best move because it would potentially have bishop h6 as a plan. I played rook e1 though, and he then played b5. And here I really didn't know how to play this. Computers say that I should play pawn c5, attempting to prevent black taking on c4 in that way. And perhaps the opening of the d file may help me to, say, play queen d2 and rook a d1. But I didn't think that c5 was that good. And as I couldn't decide entirely what to do, I played the move b3, which essentially is a move keeping the tension. And this move is a slight error because the position is seen as a bit better for white, like I assume, I don't know, maybe like 0.2 if I was giving a random number to it. But according to the computer after the game, it said that this now made the position pretty much dead equal, with depending on how long you leave the computer on, it's giving either white or black sort of 0.03 of advantage. And this is partly because it doesn't really improve my pieces or my plan at all. It's sort of a move which does keep my pawn structure fairly solid, but it doesn't really have anything more to it than this. And black sees a way for them to make my knight a worse piece. I'm interested to see, where would you put your knight if you were in this position, facing this question? Would you go to b1 and then via d2? Would you go to e2, and that way you're more in the centre than the other squares? Or would you play knight a4, putting your knight on the edge of the board? I considered all three for a brief period of time. Knight b1 to d2 looks very slow to me, and it's making your piece a lot worse. If you could play knight d2 in a couple of turns, it would be okay, but here I feel like you're just not active enough to prevent black simply winning your pawn on e4 and having enough development to claim advantage here. And even if they don't take the pawn on e4, black can easily play like e takes d, for example, and still be okay. Knight e2, similar reasons. I didn't really want to do that. So I settled on knight a4 because there are lines in the King's Indian where it's actually white who attacks a black knight in a similar way, and the black knight ends up on a5, where it surprisingly is doing a good job on controlling some of the queen side. So I thought maybe my knight and my e3 bishop could team up to fight on the dark squares. And I also set a small trap. And after knight takes e4, this is what I was hoping for, because now I have this tactic with d takes e5, and if the black pieces were to, say, take with their knight, I can play stuff like knight takes. If they take with a pawn, I can trade queens. So taking with the bishop is probably the best move. And then I suspect I can take this knight, because after bishop takes a1, I think I have bishop takes c6. And I'm the exchange down right now, but I do have the ability to win the exchange straight back, and I think my pieces are more active. So if black plays a move like I don't know, bishop takes h3 or some other move, I can take one of the rooks. Maybe e8 is the most accurate one. And what's nice about this is that when black takes me back on e8, I can take on a1. And they don't have the move bishop c3 attempting to get out of this, because I have knight takes bishop. Pawn takes, let's say, and then I can drop the bishop back, and I am still a piece up, because there's too much threatened in this position. If black were to move their bishop on a1 out of the way, as another move, say bishop f6, then I can take the a rook, and I'm still a piece up. I've got the extra knight, albeit the knight is not entirely the best knight ever. But this should be enough to win. So I'd seen this flurry of exchanges, but instead he played another move. He took with the pawn, and here I had a very nice move, similar to the previous idea, where I'm attempting to win that knight on e4. I had bishop b6, which I'd seen, because the queen has no way to guard its knight, so they can't play, say, queen h4 and guard the e4 knight, because the queen would drop. Black has to take the bishop, and then the key move is taking the queen, exchanging, and black has to take it back. There's no other move. Then I can capture this knight on b6. Right now, the material is such that I am a pawn down, but I'm attacking the rook and the knight on e4. And what this does is it will make black lose the material, because in the game black decided to save the rook, which is perfectly understandable with rook b8. And if I take the knight, they'll take my knight. So I took their bishop instead. If their knight on e4 were to move, I have things like knight e7 check, or maybe knight a7, and I should escape. Knight e7 check is actually the most accurate, but that's neither here nor there, because they took, and I took. And here I was convinced that this was a complete win. I was a piece up for only a pawn, and therefore the rest of the game would be a simple matter. But then suddenly black had this move, pawn f5. And can you see what it is black is going to do in the next move or so? What I hadn't realized was, if I move my rook on e4, they play pawn e4. So let's say I go rook e1, which is one of the best moves, and they go pawn e4. I can't save both my knight and the rook on a1. And if I were to play, I don't know, knight h2, which might be one of the best moves on the board, knight g5 is also a move, then yeah, bishop takes rook, rook takes back, and I've got two pieces for the rook, so I'm meant to be slightly ahead. But my bishop and knight are very, very bad in this position. That's kind of blocked in. And black has access to the 7th rank, or 2nd rank, with rook d2, and the only open file, which is the d file. And all this, I think, should give black at least equality, if not an advantage. Maybe I'm evaluating it badly, but I don't really like playing this kind of position as white. Therefore, can you see the move I did as white instead of playing rook e1? Can you see the best move? The problem is that I cannot save the one of the rooks or the knight. I have to lose something. What I chose to do was to capture the pawn, desperado style, because if I'm losing the exchange, I may as well get the pawn as well for it. And black did not want to take me, and partly for good reason, because after bishop takes rook, which is essentially one of the only moves, then knight takes e5, and you can clearly see the contrast between my knight and bishop in this position as opposed to the other one that I showed. Instead of my knight on h2, it's now centralized on e5. Instead of a bishop being blocked in by an e4 pawn, it now has a clear target on c6 and a lot more freedom to move around. I would be pretty happy with this setup. With black's rook d3 in this position, their plan, I think, is to play rook takes knight. Then when I take the rook back, then they take my rook, and they've won a piece. So I did two things at once. I improved my worst piece, which is the a1 rook, hasn't moved all game, and I prevented that tactic by defending my rook again. So now black was essentially forced to play bishop takes rook. I took back with the knight, and essentially I'm doing a fork on the c6 pawn and the d3 rook. And if black were to play rook d6 to defend against this, I think I can play knight takes c6. Even though I'm going to lose the pieces for the rook, which is not generally the best plan, I'm already a pawn up, and it's a passed pawn. So this may be a simpler way of playing. And I can play something like rook e7, preventing the black king from activating. And black is going to be stuck defending everything. And my king can run to the center, push my c-pawn up, and this should be a winning ending for white. So instead of that, black played rook d2, and attempting to win the a-pawn, then win the b-pawn, and push their passes. I took the pawn, although apparently knight takes c6 is a little bit stronger than bishop takes. Black was essentially forced to take me, and I retreated with a check. My bishop is anchored to my pawn. I'm blocking the d-file from access from the black rooks. And the e-file is the only open file that is readily available, which is already stood. My rook is already standing on that file. Black got out of check, so now I moved the knight to give my rook the squares to infiltrate and attack the black king. a5 was played, defending the pawns, and at this point, even though I could play a move like knight d4 to improve the knight maybe a tiny bit more by centralizing it completely, I felt like the rook check was the most important move, as it could even lead to some mates in the future. The 3 pieces attacking a king is generally what you need, and this is what I have. The knight, bishop, and rook can form several mating attacks. And also, black's slowly getting torn apart on the king side. If I can take a few pawns, I may be able to simply win with pushing past pawns on the king side as well. Black played king h6, which makes some sense. I was almost hoping for king to the f6 square, and then I have some amusing checkmates with things like pawn h4, and if black doesn't spot it and plays a move, let's say a check, and then attempts to push a pawn home, I have rook f7 checkmate, using the h4 pawn, bishop, knight, and rook as a very coordinated team. Black did not play king f6, partly for that reason, and played king h6, where the king is a bit more active. I think if king h8 were played, there should be some sort of checkmating attack that I can form, as it's so boxed in the corner of the board. I played knight e5, bringing my knight closer to the king, and also centralizing it as well. So I'm controlling the center, attacking on the king side. And black doesn't really have a good way to meet all my threats, because their rooks are badly positioned. So black's best plan, I think, is either the move he played later on, which is a4. That's the best plan, but it doesn't work for a tactical reason. Can you see the tactic I have to win the game? So well done if you found it. The move is knight f7. Now we can eliminate king g7 because it would line up with my rook, and I could then play knight d6, which would attack the black rook and put the enemy king in check. I'll take the rook next go, and as a bonus, my knight on c8, which, after taking the rook, that's where it will be, would also defend my e7 rook. So there's no way black could try and swing their king over and just in time recapture my rook with their king. So I'd win a whole rook if king g7. But the alternative is worse. King h5 is the only legal move other than g7, and this fails to bishop f3 checkmate. It's one nice mate. I'm using the g3 pawn, the knight, and my bishop to do the attack. That's why, in the game, black played g5, freeing their king up a bit and giving it the g6 square. And here I was thinking about playing rook takes h7 mate, but in order to do that I need my bishop to guard h7. I played bishop e6 to attack the rook and the f5 pawn. They defended to stop me, and at this point I had to play a little bit carefully because black may have pawn a4 in the near future. So first I got rid of their rook on the f-file to allow my bishop to take on f5, and they moved to defend h7. So black is making their pieces worse and worse, but they are still just barely holding on. And then played a4. So if I'm not totally careful, or if I don't mate them very quickly, then I could end up losing because black's pawns are quickly moving down the board and threatening to promote to queens. Again, I need to create a mating net. And there is one of my pieces that's not doing a good enough job. Which piece do you think that is? It's my knight. It's not yet close enough to the king. It turns out knight to e5 and knight to f6 are very similar on the computer evaluation. It both gives both a very large advantage for white. It's something like +8 or +9. But I played knight f6 because it was closer to the king, and I might have knight g8 check, deflecting away their rook in the future as well. They did takes. So I was thinking about playing g4, which is it's a nice move, g4. And the idea is to go knight g8 check, and when they take with their rook, which will be the only move, I can take on h7. But then I forgot that my bishop was guarding b1, so I thought that with rook back to a8, they're stopping knight g8, and then they could play b2, b1 queen. So I was being a bit too cautious, I think. That this was surely winning. But I thought another mate. I thought that after knight f6 and takes, I thought I had knight g4, king h5, and here, for some reason, I thought that I had a nice win with a sort of silly tactic, and it turned out that it didn't work, so I then had to do something else. I thought that I had the move knight to e5 in this position at the time, because when they play the move b2, I have g4 check, and then if king h4, I have knight f3 checkmate. But of course it's not checkmate because the king goes to h3, and I would then have to, work out how to win all over again. It's possible I'd still have something with knight takes g5, king h4, check. Actually, this is a very nice mate, isn't it? King h3 and then g5 mate. But I hadn't seen that far ahead. So it's possible I had the right plan, but the wrong. I didn't see the tactics well enough. And when I saw that g4 wasn't mate, I then repeated the position with knight back to f6, king h6, and then decided to try and find another way to win, which would be a bit easier than the thing I was considering. And after a little bit of thinking, I then realized that knight g4 was the right move. So I repeated yet again knight g4. If I play knight f6 one more time, it will be a draw by threefold repetition, and I will have thrown away the winning game. It turned out that I do have a very quick mate on the board. Can you find the move I played as white to finish the game in the next couple of moves? Well, the mate threat is rook e6, going for rook h6 checkmate. And black doesn't have a defense to this other than to play the move pawn h6, preventing rook takes. But then I have two different checkmates. I can go knight f6, which is mate in 1, or the move I played in the game, bishop to g6. And that way I feel like all my pieces have played a very key role in this. The rook has hemmed in the king, the bishop has been helping out the rook, and is the piece that lands the final blow. And the knight's been very good in manoeuvring around to harass the king enough to force it to the edge of the board and have a lot of assistance in the checkmates. So that was my game. Our team did end up winning fairly convincingly, but it looked for a while like we may have ended up losing on one of our boards. So at the time, it felt like the win was more necessary than it turned out to be. So that'll do it for this video. I'm going to make another one in the next few days when I play my 4NC old game, which will be on Tuesday night, so I'll probably upload on Wednesday. But I will I'll end the video here and see you next time. Bye.